Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar today. I can genuinely say that we are addressing an extremely important topic today. So, as usual, I will do the tradition which I carry out as Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'll make 3 points before I turn over the floor to the 2 distinguished panelists that we have. The first point I'm going to make, and I hope it's an obvious point, is that global governance is essentially a sunrise industry. It's a major sunrise industry because the world is shrinking in a remarkable way. And the way to describe how the world has shrunk, I say that before, when you used to live in 193 separate countries, it was like living in 193 separate boats. Now we don't live in 193 separate boats. We live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat, but with no captain or crew to take care of the boat as a whole. And that, I think, is a description of our global order today. And if you want proof of it, that we are on the same boat, ask yourself, which country worries you the most today? Which country do you worry about and say, hey, you may have invested in very good companies in Singapore, very good companies in Malaysia, or the region. But if this country decides not to pay its debts, your stock prices will crash. And of course, the country I'm talking about is Greece. And that's an indication of how we are on the same boat. What happens in a small country in Europe affects us directly. And that's why we need to strengthen global governance. And this brings me to my second point, which is that, in a sense, the institution that was set up to save the world in a crisis was the G20. In fact, it was started off, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I hope you'll be touching on it, originally as a group of finance ministers. Paul Martin, then Finance Minister of Canada, wanted to assemble a group of finance ministers to talk about the state of the world. And then you had this big Lehman Brothers crisis and all that. And ironically, it was the most unilateralist president of America, George W. Bush, that set up this new multilateral organization called G20. He convened a meeting of G20 leaders to try and save the world. In some ways, the G20 leaders, by the way, did save the world. I think it was in March, April 2009, the London meeting under the chairmanship of Gordon Brown, when everyone felt that the whole world economy was going over the cliff. The G20 leaders met and pulled the world economy back from the cliff, and we survived. So the G20, in a sense, fulfilled its purpose at that time. But since then, frankly, the G20 has had several meetings, and people are wondering, is the G20 really going to make any real difference? And we'll find out once again when they meet in Los Cabos in Mexico on 18-19 June. And this is why we have a really distinguished panel to talk about the issues. Now, we're going to begin with Mr. Peter Ong, who will speak for 15 minutes. Then he'll be followed by the ambassador. And let me just say, in my third point, a brief word about each of them. Now, you're probably wondering why the head of Singapore's civil service is talking about the G20. Now, you should know that Singapore has been invited to attend G20 meetings, I think, 3 times. Somewhat unusually, because the G20, as you'll discover, is not really 20. Sometimes it's 25, sometimes it's more. It's variable numbers. And so at each meeting, they invite countries, and Singapore has been privileged to attend 3 of these meetings, and Mr. Peter Ong actually has represented Singapore at the G20 Sherpa meetings where all the decisions are made. I should also add that in addition to being the head of civil service, he serves as Permanent Secretary of Special Duties in the Prime Minister's Office of Singapore and sits on many boards and chairs many institutions. But I should, on a personal note, mention that I had the great pleasure of working with him together when we were in the Civil Service College many years ago. He graduated with a Bachelor of Economics Honours degree from the University of Adelaide, and he holds a master's degree in business administration from Stanford University. all I want to say is that when he graduated from Stanford University, he was a top boy in the MBA class. So you're very privileged to have Peter. And after that, we'll have Ambassador Antonio Villegas. He assumed his post as Ambassador of Mexico to Singapore in November 2009, prior to the APEC Leaders Summit meeting in Singapore, in which President Felipe Calderon, Mexico, participated at that meeting. He holds a BA in law from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and practiced as an attorney at law prior to joining the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs in April 1972. I see the Mexican Foreign Ministry has lots of lawyers. I'm looking at my friend Eduardo there. He has also undertaken his master's studies in international economic law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and has served in many places before coming to Singapore. So first, Peter, you have 15 minutes, and then we turn to Ambassador Villegas. And then please, my only request to you is think of the most difficult questions you can. Because believe me, we're going through a very difficult period the next few weeks. Anticipate what the difficulties may be and pose the questions to the panelists. So over to you, Peter.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Antonio Villegas of the Embassy of Mexico, my good friend, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for this invitation to share with you some thoughts ahead of the upcoming G20 summit in Los Cabos. I want to credit Ambassador Villegas for the excellent idea of proposing this lecture to generate discussion on the deliverables and expectations for this very important summit that Mexico will be hosting next month. Indeed, there cannot be any discussion of the Los Cabos Summit without a discussion on the state of the global economy. I will not be presenting any predictions in the rest of my lecture, but I will only make one prediction, and which is that, like the 2009 London G20 Summit, the Los Cabos Summit will be yet another crisis summit. The global economy is facing intensifying downside risks. 4 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, global economic growth remains feeble and confidence is still fragile. I see three key risks currently facing the global economy that will no doubt shape the discussions of global leaders when they meet in Los Cabos. First, the ensuing tentativeness of recovery in the US. Second, the slowdown in growth in emerging economies, particularly China and India. Third, and of particular concern, the Eurozone crisis, as this can bring significant spillover and contagion effect to the rest of the world. It is without doubt that the risks resulting from the Eurozone crisis will be the top concern at this upcoming summit. Let me speak about the Eurozone crisis. The crisis has been amplified given recent political uncertainties in the Eurozone. In Greece, inconclusive results from the elections have led to fresh elections scheduled on 17th of June. And as Kishore mentioned, this is just a day before the Los Cabos Summit. Given concerns that a new Greek government would seek to make substantive changes to the agreed bailout packages, markets have started to price in the risk of Greece's exit from the Eurozone. In Spain, the deepening crisis in the banking sector, with the recent downgrade of 16 Spanish banks by Moody's, comes at a time when there is a lack of confidence in Spain's ability to recapitalize its banks and rein in its budget deficit, especially in the regions. In recent weeks, Greece and Spain also experienced some bank runs as worried depositors transferred their assets to perceived safe havens in other parts of Europe. It will therefore be crucial to take decisive action and arrest this loss of confidence or risk the contagion spreading. Franco-German leadership is key to charting a path out of the current situation. However, ideological differences on the relative emphasis between growth and austerity could pose challenges to collective policy actions at this critical juncture. Thus far, this debate has been focused on the choice between growth and austerity. For example, the trade-off between cutting expenses to rebalance fiscal budgets versus the need for spending to spur demand and growth. Secondly, the trade-off between getting political support from the electorate and doing what is needed to maintain credibility with the markets. The fact is that countries need both growth and austerity, or growth and fiscal discipline, especially countries which are in the midst of a crisis. But what is crucial is for the respective governments to regain the confidence of the markets and commit to a credible plan for adjustment and reform. This is a tricky balance. This may require some overshooting in the near term, adjustments or financing. And given the heterogeneity within the Eurozone, the pace and extent of the fiscal adjustment and structural reform programs will need to be specific to individual countries, as a one-size-fits-all approach may not make sense. Moving forward, it will require the recognition of hard economic realities by the governments and the people. Leaders will need to find the right balance between market demands and mounting political difficulties. Given the high level of economic integration within the region, leaders will have to ensure that their policies can complement one another, i.e. don't contradict each other, and yet persuade their citizens to go along for the collective good. Beyond the challenges in the Eurozone, we have also observed significant developments to other key economies. For example, the US will continue to grapple with weak recovery. GDP growth decreased from 3% in the first quarter of 2012, decreased from 3% to 2.2% in the first quarter of 2012. Unemployment is trending in the right direction, but remains high at 8%. In April, there were only 115,000 new jobs created, compared to about 12.5 million jobless Americans. On the other hand, increased consumer spending at 2.9% suggests a glimmering ray of hope at the end of the tunnel. Households have reduced their debt to disposable income by some 20 percentage points from its peak in 2008 to close to 2004 levels. Based on historical precedent, it could suggest that households, US households, could be as much as halfway through the deleveraging process, or paring down their debt. However, any contagion from the Eurozone crisis could deal a blow to the momentum in the US economy. Economies in Asia are not decoupled from the advanced economies. This is despite there being a dual-speed global economy, with low or negative growth in advanced economies and relatively higher growth in Asia. In fact, the IMF's recent study showed that advanced and emerging economies have grown more interlinked since the global financial crisis. Let's look at some key economies in Asia. Key emerging markets such as China and India are also expected to slow down. In India, growth is expected to slow to 7.1% in 2012, against 7.3% in 2011, due to high inflation, which leaves limited space for the Reserve Bank of India to maneuver. Policy makers are concerned that they would face subdued growth given the record high trade deficit of about $185 billion US, or close to 10% of GDP in March this year. In China, where many people have made very interesting observations, economic growth has actually moderated since the first quarter of 2012. Export growth slowed to 4.9% year-on-year in April this year, due mainly to weaknesses in Eurozone demand. Import growth has also suffered a large dip to a meager 0.3% growth year-on-year, down from 5% growth in the previous month. The biggest downside surprise was in industrial production in China, which slowed by 2.6 percentage points to 9.3% year-on-year in April. This is the first time it's fell to a single-digit growth since May 2009. Given this weaker than expected growth data, analysts have downgraded growth forecasts for China in the second quarter from 8.5% to 7.6%. More recently, policymakers have also signaled the implementation of more proactive fiscal and monetary policy to maintain this growth in China. On 12th of May, the People's Bank of China cut the reserve requirement ratio by 50 basis points. High global oil prices also present a risk to global growth. Oil prices rose 20% since the start of the year to over $128 per barrel in March this year. While prices have since come down from that high and supply has increased over the past few weeks, we obviously must continue to monitor the risks and the risks of oil prices and their economic impact, especially with geostrategic developments in the Middle East. The relief is that Asia continues to grow at a high rate. The continued growth in domestic demand, local domestic demand, would hopefully buffer the reduction in consumption and demand from Europe. Banking systems in Asia are also better capitalized. Against this backdrop, there would be complex and difficult policy choices facing G20 policymakers. This would include, number one, stimulating growth through an innovative mix of fiscal and monetary policies in an environment where public debt remains high and monetary policy is already very accommodating. Two, managing spillover effects of possible easing of monetary policies in advanced economies, especially onto emerging economies. Three, ensuring that sufficient credit continues to flow to the economy to support the growth agenda, even as banks continue to cut down on their own debt. Ensuring inclusive growth in Europe and US, where high unemployment has resulted in strains to the social compact. According to the UN's International Labour Organization, the world needs to create 600 million new jobs over the next 10 years to sustain economic growth and maintain social stability. Fueling global growth, especially in emerging economies, through rebalancing external demand with greater domestic demand. And finally, stimulating the multilateral trade system to generate sustainable economic activity. Of course, the bigger question now is what are the possible measures for Europe? As seen from the EU summit last week, there are no easy solutions, but there are both immediate short-term measures and also medium-term considerations. Namely, number one, to ready the firewall and ring-fence any contagion. Number two, to ensure sustainable development and growth over the medium term. Firstly, let me talk about readying the firewall and ring-fencing any contagion. It will be important to ensure that the European Stability Mechanism, or ESM, which is Europe's bailout fund, can be enforced as scheduled on 1st of July. This requires national parliaments to ratify the treaties to effect this. This will be crucial in securing the boost of confidence to markets that Europe has a permanent facility to combat any fallout. In terms of monetary policy, the European Central Bank will need to make a firm and clear commitment to do whatever it takes to secure financial stability, including long-term refinancing operations, or what they call LTRO, and purchases of government debt. European leaders will also need to accelerate further integration with more fiscal union and have the necessary institutions to oversee and refinance banks, raise bank deposit guarantees, and provide greater fiscal backing for the southern states. Another option which was raised is to have Eurobonds, and these are bonds which are jointly issued by all Eurozone countries for further fiscal liability sharing for a limited amount of debt from reforming Eurozone economies. To promote sustainable development, job creation, and growth reforms, there will need to be rebalancing within the Eurozone, but without compromising fiscal discipline. In the near term, increased government engagement with the public and introduction of labour market reforms will be important to sustain public support and stave off negativity on austerity. Labour market reforms will be a key component to secure public support, given its direct impact on people's livelihoods. At the same time, it also helps countries avoid a persistent low output trap following the fiscal tightening. In the longer term, there is potential for more infrastructure investments in countries like Germany and other AAA-rated countries like perhaps the Netherlands. It is encouraging to note that the EU leaders last week reached a consensus to recapitalize the European Investment Bank. There is also scope for further service sector reforms in surplus countries such as in Germany. There are further economic reforms in the service sector which could booster competitiveness, not only in Greece, Italy, and Spain, but also in the larger countries like France and Germany. This brings us to the last Cabag summit next month, where these policy options to deal with the Eurozone crisis will undoubtedly take center stage. In fact, the results of the Greek elections just a day before will shape both the tone and the outcomes of the summit. The international community has certainly high stakes riding on this summit. The Mexican presidency faces the challenge of managing public expectations amidst the current crisis environment, coupled with the accumulated agenda from the past summits. Given the narrow policy options available, leaders will need to be innovative and have to make difficult decisions. The G20, as Kishore mentioned, has been credited for responding well to the global financial crisis with the necessary leadership and decisive measures. The strong spirit of international cooperation marked that collective response during the London summit. This same sense of international cooperation remains fundamental for achieving sustainable global growth going forward. Alongside dealing with the immediate crisis in the Eurozone, it would also be necessary to find a way to sustain global growth over the medium term. G20 leaders should continue the emphasis on fundamentals for a better balanced global economy and more sustainable growth. Otherwise, we will just lurch from one crisis to another. For this summit, 3 work streams will undergird these fundamentals. Number 1, the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. Number 2, the international financial architecture. And number 3, financial regulation work. The framework, as I mentioned, would set the tone for the summit beyond. I would think that the focus should be on implementation and prioritizing measures that will boost medium-term growth. On the international financial architecture, which really has to do with what we do with entities like the World Bank and the IMF, there would be expectations of progress on the implementation of the so-called 2010 quota and governance reforms of the IMF, so that G20 member countries would sign off onto the deadline, which is to ratify these reforms by the IMF 4 meetings in October this year. Progress in this area will be crucial to reinforce the confidence and credibility of countries' commitments to increase IMF resources to strengthen the global firewall. There have also been much progress made in reforming the international financial regulatory environment. I think all of us know that the global financial crisis was a result of lax financial regulations. In the current transitioning from design to implementation of a new regulatory environment, these generally include measures to improve the capacity of the Financial Stability Board, as well as implementation of rules that govern shadow banking and OTC derivatives. And it would include policy measures to address systemically important financial institutions. These are the banks that are deemed too big to fail, and obviously we need a different set of regulatory framework for them. Implementation of these financial regulatory reforms would also be one of the longer-term priorities for the G20 in order to strengthen the resilience of banking systems and prevent emergence of excesses of the last decade. The development agenda of the G20 will also continue to be important. There is a need to build on past work, as this is a multi-year work plan. Given the recent cutbacks in project finance in emerging economies due to the deleveraging of European banks, we will likely see some emphasis on promoting infrastructure financing. In fact, infrastructure financing has also taken on greater importance in our own regional discussions in Asia, especially since European banks used to provide up to 1/3 of trade and project financing in Asia. At their recent meeting in Manila, the ASEAN+3 finance ministers agreed on infrastructure financing as a priority area in their work plan for this year. I've tried to, in my speech, to outline the critical components of the G20 deliberations, namely the need to address the ongoing Eurozone crisis and the need to generate medium-term growth prospects. The policy options are not obvious, and the trade-offs will be difficult to make. Much depends on what happens between now and the summit. We wish the Mexican presidency all the very best as they steer the discussions and deliver a positive outcome for the global economy. Thank you very much.
Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. Mr. Peter Ong, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance. Excellencies, dear colleagues of the Diplomatic Corps. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all. It is always a privilege to be back to this prestigious center of academic study and research to share with you today some views on the preparations and priorities for the upcoming G20 summit in Los Cabos, Baja California Sur, Mexico. I would be pleased to come out of this meeting enriched with your commentaries and suggestions. I want to express my deep gratitude to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and to the distinguished Dean, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, for hosting this event today and honoring us by chairing it. Many thanks also to the Vice Dean, Dr. Astrid Tumines, for her kind interest and valuable assistance in this initiative. My sincere gratitude goes also to another good friend of Mexico, an outstanding public servant of Singapore, Mr. Peter Ong, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, who is sharing with us today his insights into the international financial situation and the G20. Thank you all for joining us today. In 3 weeks, President Felipe Calderón will be welcoming and playing host to the leaders of the most powerful economies of the world for the G20 Leaders Summit in Los Cabos. The global scenario preceding the Mexican summit could not be more challenging. Professor Mahbubani's introductory remarks and Mr. Ong's presentation draw a clear picture of the issues the G20 leaders will be facing when they meet in Los Cabos. I would like to concentrate my presentation on 3 aspects, namely, what the G20 is not, what it is, and what are Mexico's priorities and preparations as the current chair of the group for the Los Cabos meeting. The G20 is not a substitute organization or one that aspires to take the place or supplant the United Nations, the World Bank, or the International Monetary Fund. It is not a negotiating instance on behalf of the international community or an international organization itself with operative capacity. And certainly it is not and does not pretend to be an almighty council of the world with executive powers. What the G20 is: the collapse in the early 1970s of the economic order put in place in 1945 by the Bretton Woods system created a severe global governance gap that provoked the need to create new informal multilateral coordination groups like the G7, which later became the G8. The increasing multipolarity of economic power soon made evident the dysfunctionality of the G8. Therefore, in 2005, an extended dialogue was instituted with the G5, Mexico, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, which together represented 26% of world GDP in 2011, considered emerging powers with more weight, demographics, and regional leadership. Due to the magnitude of the 2008 financial crisis, the G20, established in 1999, first at the level of ministers of finance and central banks, was brought up to the heads of state and government level, conformed by the following 19 countries and the European Union. These countries represent together 85% of the world GDP, 80% of the world trade, and 65% of the world population. Even before the G20 was formalized as a high-level forum in 2008, other groups, such as the Group of Eight or the G8+5, where emerging economies played a role, were actively engaged in addressing challenging global economic and financial issues. Since its inception, in the midst of a severe world crisis that was the worst in many decades, the G20 has made important contributions to economic and financial governance, starting with the economic stimulus packages adopted successfully to counter the crisis of 2008 and 2009, and other measures contributing to strengthening the structure and governance of the international monetary system. Mexico will be the second emerging country and the first Latin American country to chair the G20 after the Republic of Korea in November 2010. Since assuming the presidency of the group last December, the government of Mexico vowed to amplify the voice of the emerging economies and to lead an inclusive, transparent, and equitable presidency. It is very timely that the G20 summit this year is held in Latin America, a region that has experienced its past share of crisis and today is growing, as is Asia, at higher economic rates than the developed countries. Mexico's 5 priorities for the Los Cabos summit are intended to bring a balance between urgent matters that need the group's political impulse, as well as medium and long-term issues. They also aim to ensure continuity of and following up on previous commitments that are of interest to both developed and developing countries. President Felipe Calderón set out these priorities at the Cannes summit last December as follows. Number 1, economic stabilization and structural reforms as foundations for growth and employment. 2, strengthening the financial system and fostering financial inclusion to promote economic growth. 3, improving the international financial architecture in an interconnected world. 4, enhancing food security and addressing commodity price volatility. And 5, promoting sustainable development, green growth, and the fight against climate change. Mexico has so far organized 1 meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs, the first of its kind in the G20 preparatory process, 2 meetings of Ministers of Finance and Central Banks, governors, 2 meetings of Vice Ministers of Agriculture, 1 meeting of Ministers of Trade and Economy, 4 meetings of Sherpas, 1 of Ministers of Tourism, and 1 of Ministers of Employment and Labor. In a similar way, the different working groups of the G20, responsible for areas like development, clean and efficient energies, employment, and anti-corruption, among others, have held several meetings. Here are briefly some highlights about the outcome of this preparatory process. The meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs held in Los Cabos in February had the objective to analyze how the G20 can effectively face the most pressing challenges to global governance and to achieve actions to face not only conjunctural crises, but also to take care of structural needs that can prevent future crises. Foreign Affairs ministers coincided on the need to reform multilateral institutions within the existing framework and agreed to take advantage of existing instruments and mechanisms to fulfill previous commitments. The G20 finance ministers and central bank governors held their second meeting in April in Washington, D.C. They highlighted that recent economic developments point to the continuation of a modest global recovery. They reaffirmed their full commitment to supporting growth and job creation, structural reforms, restoring medium-term fiscal sustainability, and promoting global rebalancing. In this context, they welcome the Euro area members' decision in March to strengthen European firewalls as part of broader reform efforts. The G20 countries, together with the IMF Committee, reached agreement to enhance IMF resources for crisis prevention and resolution. There are firm commitments to increase resources made available to the IMF by over $430 billion US dollars. That is $180 billion more than the amount that was used in 2009 to help avert the crisis. These resources will be available for the whole membership of the IMF and not earmarked for any particular region. As on previous occasions, G20 members reaffirmed their commitment to advance the IMF governance and quota reform to better reflect the relative weights of its members in the world economy. Finally, there were significant advances in the priorities set by the Mexican G20 presidency, such as financial inclusion, transparency, and better functioning of energy markets, inserting green growth strategies into structural reform agendas, and options to effectively mobilize resources for financing climate change. In third place, the G20 Economy and Trade Ministers meeting discussed the functioning of global supply chains and their impact on international trade. The ministers agreed that there is a positive link between open trade and economic growth and employment, provided that trade policies complemented with the appropriate macroeconomic policies and poverty reduction strategies. Fourth, the G20 agricultural vice ministers and international organization representatives met in Mexico City in April to review the implementation of prior commitments agreed upon last year in the action plan on price volatility and agriculture, the Seoul multi-year action plan on development, and the Cannes Leaders Declaration. And fifth, the working group on employment, with a meeting of ministers of employment and labor, allowed to identify policies that can contribute to the creation of quality jobs, while the working group on development has followed up on the Seoul plan for multilateral action on development. To incorporate the voices of different sectors and key players of the international system, Mexico has conducted an extensive outreach dialogue with non-G20 countries, regional and international organizations, businessmen, youth, NGOs, think tanks, and civil society in general. 3 examples of such exercises are Think 20, the first time in the G20 process that the presidency hosted a meeting with think tanks from around the world, the Y20 or Youth 20 event targeted to encourage the active participation of young students and professionals, and the B20 Summit for the private sector, third of this kind, designed to allow leaders of the private sector to contribute their recommendations on issues in which participation of their businesses is crucial. To conclude, we see the Los Cabos Summit as a great opportunity to face the new challenges together and to strengthen the capacity of the G20 to contribute with solutions. Global governance regimes and mechanisms need clear and decisive political guidance in order to fulfill their mandates. The multilateral system remains our best international guarantee of stability and legality. Mexico is aware of the great challenges the multilateral system faces with regards to a globalized economy that requires truly global solutions. The G20, as an informal and flexible forum, is in a key position to advance discussions on such fundamental issues. Mexico will use its presidency to advance an agenda that looks beyond the urgency without neglecting the most pressing issues. It is an agenda focused on inclusive policies that will be crucial to sustainable economic growth and prosperity. One central objective of Mexico's presidency of the G20 in the upcoming summit is to show the value of the G20 in finding solutions for the problems that affect the world. Its outcomes must lead not only to better global governance, but also, and above all, to tangible progress for society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to take advantage of my position as chair to ask the first difficult question before I throw the floor open to you all. And as you heard, I mean, Mexico has been making a tremendous amount of preparations. And in most of these summits, everything, they try to pre-cook everything. I think the Sherpas, if I'm not mistaken, meet, work out the documents, work out the statements. Often they're ready a week or two beforehand. The problem is, as Peter was saying earlier, is that the summit this year in Mexico is going to be a crisis summit. And especially if on June 17th, the Greek electorate decides to vote in a government that, in a sense, in one way or another, explicitly or implicitly rejects the package deal that Greece has reached to solve its problem. So that happens on June 17th. Everybody will expect the leaders on June 18th to say, okay, how do we react to this? So my question is a procedural question to both of you, Peter and to Ambassador Villegas. How would the G20 leaders scramble and try to find an effective response to a crisis that would have emerged 24 hours earlier? What would be the procedural things they need to do?
Well, we could call for Hulk to come and help to crush the crisis.
Your film was wonderful.
No, I think none of us want to see that scenario happen. Yeah. Yes, the elections will be too close to the date of the summit. The summit was not planned considering the elections in Greece. But I don't believe the result of the election will immediately have an effect. The new government will have to be installed. It has to consider its options. And hopefully, this is a problem that has to be dealt by in different levels. The first is the national level. It's a problem of Greece, election in Greece. The electors have to vote considering the whole array of situations in the table. And then the government elected will have to also see to its duties, its responsibilities. It certainly will have a lot of effect in the crisis, but I think so close to the summit, it will be very difficult that the summit has any reaction to that.
So I don't know. Your answer is that the summit will not be able to react then?
It will be very worried if the election is changing the government. But I don't think the government will be in a position, the government of Greece in that moment to completely derange the process. No?
Peter?
In a sense, what we may experience, we had a little foretaste of that in Cannes last year. If you remember, in the summit last year, just days before the summit, the then Greek Prime Minister decided he would not go on, proceed to follow the package that was agreed. And of course, he was summoned, he was sort of invited, I would say, to the summit to...
Is this the one he called for referendum,
that's
right?
Right.
That's right. George Papandreou at the time.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and then after very intensive discussions, he decided, well, okay, they will continue, but they will call for elections, I think, and the rest, as they say, is history. So we have a little glimpse of that. I'm looking at the French ambassador. Maybe he can share with us what happened in those very intensive meetings during the French presidency. This year, obviously, the time frame between the outcome of the elections and the summit is obviously very short. It's just the day after. Essentially, this is something for the Greek people to decide. I think the rest of the world, we wish them well. We obviously, I think, if you ask any European today, I think most of the leaders really want Greece to continue with the program and stay within the euro. And I think the cost of an exit, of Greece, say, from the eurozone is just very high. And I think everyone wants Greece, obviously, to stay within the program and within the euro. But that's, as is the case for all elections, the people of Greece must decide. And I think after they decide on 17, then the rest of the world can then respond to that. But obviously, it will take a while. It will take a while for them to form. It will take some time for them to form the government and come to an agreement on what they want to do with the very pressing issue of whether they continue with the program or not. Yeah.
I am T.N. Srinivasan. I'm from the Lee Kuan Yale last year. My question to you, gentlemen, both of you, is this. What is the credibility of G20? If you go by the commitments that they made in the various summits from Washington summit on, it doesn't encourage one to think that the G20 is a credible group. I'll give you one example. They committed themselves to concluding the Doha round within the year 2010 in more than one summit. And as we all know, they didn't deliver. Second, you listed the stimulus in 2008. That had started even before the Washington summit. The Paulson TARP predates the first summit of G20. And so to claim that G20 engaged in summit, engaged in stimulus and brought the world back from the brink is an exaggerated claim. Now, you can go on, and in the financial stability, they've delegated the tasks to IMF and the World Bank to do the work. But the independent evaluation organizations of both IMF and the World Bank have conclusively shown in their reports that neither was capable and neither did anything that could have been sensibly done during the run-up to the crisis. And there is no evidence that they are any better positioned now to do anything in the future. Euro, finally, what needs to be done is well known. It has been well known for several years. The birth defect of euro, having a common currency without the needed fiscal or political union, that has to be corrected. And I have no idea whether, after all the Euro leaders meeting several times before the G20 summit next month, not having done anything sensibly, there is any reason to believe that they are going to do it in Las Cabos.
Thank you, Tian. So, who would like to start?
Since we're not members.
Yeah. What is the credibility of the G20?
Well, I think the question of credibility is common to all international organizations and all summits. People is very skeptic, no? When there is a summit and you're familiar with the views of so many people joining together to protest against these meetings. That's why we have to be very careful in managing expectations. G20, as I tried to present, came to life because of the lack of credibility, lack of efficiency of the existing financial and economic institutions who were not capable to come with solutions for the crisis. You have to understand, and this is one effort the presidency of the G20, Mexican presidency, is doing, that this is a long-term process that you need. Is not a governing council. The G20 does not decide. It's a very, very valuable tool of informal and flexible consultations between a group of very influential countries that once they decide on actions or they decide on options, it can help to bring solutions by coming to the international, reinforcing the existing international institutions. But you're right, the credibility is an issue in all multilateral organizations. That's why the G20, we have to preserve it at all costs by not creating excessive expectations. But I do believe sincerely that if the G20 did not exist, we would need to invent it today because it's really useful. There was nothing in its place, and it has proven by time its utility. That's my answer, my comment. Thank you.
Okay. Peter, you want to add something?
Well, Singapore is not a member of the G20. When we show up, we are invited guests, so my comments have to be taken in that context. So I'm not qualified to speak as a member, but really
But
more
you can say the G20 is more credible when Singapore is invited.
Yeah. That's Kishore's. No, I think we are a very small country. I think to try to understand the magnitude of the problem, you are at the same time fighting a fire as you are rewriting the fire code. You're at the same time dealing with a very immediate issue, and in London they dealt with a crisis. I think in Las Cabos they have to deal with, unfortunately, a crisis. But at the same time, they're trying to put in place medium-term to long-term institutions and structures and agreements that hopefully will prevent the next crisis. So I think it's a very difficult balancing act. A good friend of mine, Mr. Dan Price, who was the Sherpa for the US, the former administration, wrote in, I think, the Wall Street Journal, I believe, he says, however you judge the G20 depends on whether you see the glass as half empty or half full. I think in terms of, I would say, notwithstanding your comments, I think many would recognize that at the London summit, the leaders were able to put in place a very robust and muscular set of measures which was able to reverse the tide of the lack of the decline in confidence in the market and reversed the very negative market confidence at that point in time. They talked about resourcing the IMF and the World Bank, which really was very critical in helping to arrest this decline in confidence. They put in place a mutual assessment program, and it's a very technical way of saying that countries sit around a table and talk about very sensitive topics like the exchange rate and balance of payments imbalances. Before the London summit, these were all very sensitive issues, but the fact that the G20 can put it at the table, and now countries are hopefully diligently writing out their action plans. Everyone has to write the action plan under this framework, MAP, to say what they will do to rebalance the global economy. The fact that we are able to do that around the table, it's really credit to the G20. But I do agree with you, and here I share the same disappointment as you've expressed, that on critical issues like multilateral trade, the Doha round, we've not been able, the leaders have not been, or G20 has not been able to give it the necessary political push. I think history will judge the G20. For now, I think we are all very focused on making sure the Los Cabos Summit
I am an ignoramus, so the question I'm asking is, the countries that need the money, the euro, how much do they need to get them out of this? On the other side are the countries that have large surpluses, like China's giant surpluses, the Middle East countries, oil countries. What do you think could happen if they made a deal, and at what price would they want to extract for the loans they give to the euro? Keeping in mind that the world economy is on the US dollar, will the US government be prepared to stop out money and see its dollar go down further to help its neighbor euro? Thank you.
Well, I asked for difficult questions. I got difficult questions.
Well, the easy answer to the question is, if you could call up all the ambassadors of the different countries you have listed and ask each one of them whether they would be prepared to come up with a deal. I can't speak for any one of these countries. I can only, it's a very difficult question. Will the U.S. dump up the money? I think, as we all know, the U.S. is going through a very difficult process of fiscal consolidation, and both sides of the aisle need to agree by a certain deadline towards the end of this year on how to deal with that so-called fiscal cliff that the U.S. will face. So, and the politics behind it, I think the politics that have led to the emergence of the Tea Party and the like, we all read about it. It's all very difficult, even in the U.S. Even in China, I think they are going through their own growth issues this year. Of course, we may say in April, there was 1 month of data. Obviously, they will need to rely on more time series of the data flow. But if there should be a slowdown in China, you would expect that the Chinese government will want to make sure that it will pump the money, apply their own resources to their needs domestically. I think every government face, whether you are a more centrally planned government or democracy, you need to justify the use of public resources. And I think that the discussion is difficult because before you give the money, like before the IMF will give the money, it usually requires a program where the recipient countries need to follow a certain set of policies, because it's not obviously free money. And I think the question now is for, as I mentioned, for countries to decide through the elections what kind of program they like to follow. A program of growth or a program of austerity, which is what some of these IMF programs require. And only they can decide. And I see that it will be quite difficult for countries that decide that they do not want to go into a process of tightening their own belt, to expect that other countries would tighten their belt in order for resources to flow. So it's as much politics as it is sort of common sense economics of just sharing the spoils. It's not as simple as it seems, unfortunately.
Mr. Villegas, you want to add something?
Well, difficult to add something to what
Yes.
Mr. Ong said, but yeah, well, in principle, the Greek crisis has been already solved through this agreement within the Eurozone countries, no? The Euro has sufficient means to help Greece. Greece is a part of a integration process. So in principle, the money is there in Europe. It's a question to pursue the arrangement, no, that has been made within the zone.
Next question.
Sally Clark. I'm just wanting to touch a bit on the topic of financial regulation.
Betty, where are you from, Betty?
I'm from England.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And to touch upon it in the sense of you've spoken about the G20 having a focus on financial regulation. We are still today seeing challenges with the investment banks, of them losing JP Morgan 2 billion a couple of weeks ago, UBS losing almost 5 billion 6 months ago. And I just wanted to ask the panel if they could give some reflections on how successful regulation of the investment banks and the financial markets has been, given the fact that we're still seeing these types of shocking losses. Thank you.
Since you've done some regulation.
I think the role of forums like the G20 is really not so much to specify internal bank risk management processes, but to understand risk at the systemic level, to make sure that if you have traders who are prepared to take your bank to the brink, that whatever you do does not affect the system, the financial system. And that's where the G20 has done some good work on making sure that systemically important financial institutions do not impose, that when they undertake risk activities, that they do not impose a systemic risk. And there's a lot of work on it. It's all very technical. That's one area that they are working on. There are obviously a lot of work on the issue of capital, whether the adequacy of capital, and that's, again, a way for the banks to buffet themselves in case
That's Basel III. Right?
Basel III, that's right. So working together with Basel III, these are other ways in which we try, the regulators try to make sure that there is enough of a buffer on the part of the banks. Then obviously the formation of the Financial Stability Board is yet another, I think thanks to the G20, they've got this form, and obviously it's a very important institution that continues to do very good work. I mentioned in my speech on the issue of shadow banking, to make sure this is something very complicated again, that shadow banking is probably properly regulated, and also OTC derivatives. The work is still going on, and we certainly hope that the system as a whole, you don't see the kind of risk that we saw in the last crisis. Yeah.
You add something on that?
Well, just to add that it's an issue permanently in the agenda, subject to continued improvement, and to the experiences of because when the last summit to the next summit, the last crisis to the next crisis, things are completely different. That's why it's a very convenient, flexible mechanism, and to permit to adapt to the changing circumstances. So definitely it's a matter under continuous consideration and improvement.
Next question, please. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Mr. Jimenez from an MPM student from this school. My question is addressed to Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Mexico. I noted earlier that you mentioned that, and I congratulate your presidency of the G20, that this is a good chance for Mexico to speak for emerging economies. My question is, how would Mexico approach this opportunity to speak for other emerging economies, not member of the G20, when two of the most important issues are trade and immigration? And I note this because Mexico has one of the largest immigrant community in the world as well. How would Mexico approach this when, in fact, as mentioned earlier by Minister Ong, the G20 countries, I believe, did not just give political guidance to the failure, resulting to the failure of the Doha rounds. I think they were the cause. The refusal to consider agricultural subsidies, which is very important for emerging economies, and the rising anti-immigrant bias in many of these countries in the G20, which for understandable reasons. And I would like to cite the building of the Texas Wall in the Mexico-US border as a symbol of this emerging anti-immigration tendency. As a matter of fact, you're still debating that. How would Mexico speak for the rest of the emerging economies? What kind of framework are you looking at in terms of trade and labor? Your Excellency, thank you very much.
Well, the question of migration is not part of the agenda. Certainly, trade is one. The G8 main core subjects is the financial situation, the financial institutions. But trade is part of it, and in this preparatory process, we have also held in the working group of development a meeting of ministers of work. How do we incorporate in the agenda the issues of interest to the developing world? Well, through these issues, through trade. For example, a meeting of ministers of trade examine the questions now in the agenda, and they agree that we don't need to come with a very lengthy declarations calling the usual that Doha should be, the round should be completed soon, but rather focusing on very specific issues which the developed countries can do to increase, to favor the terms of trade with the developing countries. Also, in the terms of the climate change. Climate change is an issue that is of absolutely concern for everybody, but that causes the largest pain in the least developed countries. Mexico, as a host for the UN Conference on Climate Change in 2010, has a very keen interest in including climate change. Climate change, in moments of difficulty, of slow growth in the world, is seen as superfluous, is seen as something unnecessary. But Mexico is stressing across the board in the agenda that climate change does not need to be expensive, that climate change can contribute to innovation, to efficiency, to competitivity, and to trade. So in this way, Mexico tries to contribute in many other issues across the agenda to reflect the point of view of the developing world.
Okay, next question. Is there a mic there? Can you use it? Yeah.
Götz Bischoff, Credit Suisse. Actually, if we look at the value of the Mexican peso and the Singapore dollar over the last couple of weeks, we see a substantial depreciation in both currencies, probably mostly due to the European crisis. As the next couple of months or weeks will probably also be quite challenging, are there any plans in place to intervene in the currency markets to actually support the respective currencies in case Greece goes down? Thanks.
Singapore dollar's gone down how much?
I haven't been monitoring the Singapore dollar. You know, as you probably know, if you come to the press conference organized by my colleagues at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, twice a year, the Monetary Authority of Singapore will spell out its exchange rate policy so that it can give guidance to the markets at those two specific points in time. The rest of the time, the rest of us keep quiet about exchange rate policy. And it's probably very wise.
Shucks, I was going to go out and make a bet tonight. How about you? How's the Mexican currency doing?
Well, in the case of Mexico, economy has been growing at a healthy rate, 5% 2011, 4% so far this year. Unemployment is at the level of 5%, and trade is growing very, very strongly. So the exchange rate, as you know, in the case of Mexico, is not a decision of the government. It's an independent central bank, which establishes it according to the market. So there has not been such a large change. It's a reflection of the trade, but it's nothing to do with the economy.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'm Aaron from the local media Straits Times. You talked about the G20 being in a crisis summit back in 2008, and now it's also a crisis summit in June. But do you think if, let's say, the fire, as Mr. Ong described it, breaks out, whether there will still be the same political will to carry out what is needed in those instances in 2008 where you described as being brave? Do you, both panelists, believe that G20 will still have the political will, the confidence and courage to do something to pull back the economy the way it did in 2008, if it so happens to descend into chaos again this time around?
Well, I'm certain that things come to that. G20 will be offering total political support and economic support to overcome this situation, because it's a situation that, in the end, can, given the interconnectedness of the world, as Professor Mawani was saying, we are not so many ships, but apartments in one ship. So the interconnectedness would mean would hurt the whole world. So the G20 would be ready. It's not, as I mentioned, a substitute for the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, but within its scope, in the coordination, in the consultations, and the channels that the G20 has to help, it will be certainly ready to offer political support as well as economic support, as it has done in previous crises in the 2008 and 2009, because it's not convenient for any country.
Peter, you had something?
Yeah, I think a lot depends on what specifically happens. It's very, I mean, there are many actors involved in this, and there are different scenarios that can be played out. But I think that the leaders who gather in Los Cabos obviously will be very committed to bringing stability to the international financial system, and I think they want growth to continue and for the recovery to take root. I would just add the point that compared to 2009 in London, policymakers today have less space, less fiscal space, because many of them, as we know, are in the throes of fiscal consolidation. They have less space in terms of monetary policy because monetary policy, as I mentioned in my lecture, is already very accommodating. You know, central banks have already assured that they will not be raising, some central banks, I mean, have already set out their very accommodating monetary policy. And then unemployment is quite high in many, many countries. So that, again, provides less space for political consensus to be forged on the more difficult measures which may be necessary. So I think the overall climate will be one where the space offered to the leaders who gather in Los Cabos will be quite limited. But I think that obviously they are all very committed. As you heard, the G8 leaders in Camp David to want to ensure that stability can be restored, and in the specific case of Greece, even to stay within the Eurozone and to operate within that framework and context.
Let me just add a footnote to the two responses to try and see whether I can inject a little bit of optimism into the doom and gloom that we've been hearing. And it's just that, as you know, leaders are concerned about their country's futures. Leaders are also concerned about their own futures. And this year, the two biggest economies in the world, United States and China, are both of them going through very significant political transitions. I guarantee you that if there's a major repeat of the financial crisis, the US economy tanks, Obama is going to have a very hard time getting re-elected. I think President Obama has a very strong, vital, personal interest in making sure everything works out okay. And China also is going through a very significant leadership transition this year. It already had a few bumps in the road in the way. And I think the last thing that the China wants actually is another big crisis, which is why I think something very significant happened a few weeks ago when an event like Chen Guangcheng should have derailed the US-China talks, you know, should have. But the fact that both US and China had much bigger interests to cooperate, to take care of their own both respective desire for stability means that they shipped out Chen Guangcheng and said, don't disrupt, I got bigger things at play here. So there are other political forces at play, I hope, that will come into play at the G20 meeting, which is why, by the way, the fundamental point here is that, as you said, if the G20 did not exist today, it would have to be invented, frankly. Because if you look about the G8 meeting, you mentioned the G8 meeting, there were the days, the good old days, when the G8 meetings would meet, there'll be a vast media circus and everyone thinks the G8 is going to save the world. Today a meeting happened and everyone knows the G8 can no longer save the world. It's now the G20. It is the new game in town. It's a very complicated, difficult game to understand, for which I think I'm really grateful that both Ambassador Villegas and Peter Ong decided to tackle the most difficult subject facing the world today. And please join me now in thanking them.